Good day, American government students. This is odd to be doing a recording, but I sent an email to your parents. They may have explained to you what's going on, but because Ms. Knoll and I have to share the cafeteria space and we both give lectures, we decided it just wouldn't work for me to be talking, you know how loud I can be, and her to be talking at the same time, just 20 feet apart. No matter how you try to set up partitions, it won't stop the sound of my loud voice. And it would just be distracting. So what we've done is we've decided to split up the week for this first 2 or 3 weeks of class. Now, first off, no, this is very temporary. I am told it should take no more than 3 weeks for the emergency door to be installed in my classroom and for us to get back to normal. So 3 weeks from now, God willing, we will be in my classroom. I will be lecturing in front of my whiteboard as normal, okay? But in the meantime, on Tuesdays, I am going to be lecturing to you on video format here. You'll be listening with earbuds or headphones, so it won't be distracting to you to have Ms. Knoll talking in the other part of the cafeteria. And you can hear my lecture. I'll still be in the room. You'll be filling out a couple of questions that I'm going to have written out for you. So you'll listen to the lecture, do your written work, and give it to me before you leave class, hopefully today. If not, I guess you could do it as homework, but it'd be easier just to give it to me now. So you'll hear the lecture on video on Tuesday. If you're with me on Wednesday, I will be able to talk and show videos in the cafeteria on Wednesday. And on Thursday, I'm the one with the lecture privileges. So I'll be talking to you, teaching you live in person on Thursday in the cafeteria. So Tuesday video lectures this week, next week, maybe we'll have to do it one more week after that. But hopefully in just over 3 weeks' time, we'll be back to normal in my classroom, talking live person to person every day. Okay. But for now, I'm sitting up there. If you have a question, come up and ask me tutorial wise. Otherwise, this is not great, but this is what we've got until the doors are in and we're back in our classrooms. So I'll have a little whiteboard with me. So on Thursday, when I give you a normal lecture, I can do a little bit of my whiteboard work. Anyhow, so your textbook is this thing. I think it might even be in a second edition now. I've recommended to your parents getting the hardbound or the paperback. Either one. I don't care, as long as a hard copy of the textbook. You can use a PDF. You can bring your laptop. But I will tell you from experience, the PDFs on laptops and tablets, a lot of times it takes a long time to download. Oftentimes the pagination doesn't work out like the book. So it's hard to follow where we are. I'm a book guy. I like real books. So I'm hoping many of you have the real book. But if you can't, then the PDF works too. Okay? All right. We are not going to look at chapter 1 today. It has some key ideas we will get to. But we're going to start with chapter 2, the United States Constitution. The book's chapter starts off with a little history. I'm a history teacher, so I'm fully qualified to talk to you about that. There might be a couple of you who don't know me yet. So you should know that I have a master's degree in intellectual history. I have studied history my whole life, but I'm also a lawyer. I am licensed to practice law in Texas, and I love talking about the law and the way our government functions. I have taught government many times at the high school level. So you should be you're getting my best efforts, and I know a lot about this stuff. I'm also a clergyman, so when we talk about the First Amendment, freedom of religion, I tend to dwell a little bit extra on religious topics. So anyway, if you're new, welcome. Most of you know me pretty well by now. Okay, so we're looking at chapter 2, little history background. You know that America begins as 13 British colonies on the east coast of North America. And those colonies grew fairly rapidly in the course of the 1700s. They'd reached a population of well over 1 million before the American War for Independence began. But one catalyst for the events that would lead to our independence was a war with France. In America, we tend to call it the French and Indian War. In Britain, it's normally known as the 7 Years' War. 1756 to 1763, 7 years. It was a world war. It was fought in North America, fought in Europe, fought in India, between France and Britain and their allies. But in America, we usually call it the French and Indian War because American colonists and British troops in North America were fighting each other alongside each other against the French and their Indian allies, Native American allies. Well, the British won after 7 years, and they won a lot of territory in North America. They won all of Canada. They won all what was then called the Ohio Territory, all the way to the Mississippi River. Great. But it cost Britain a lot of money to fight the 7 Years' War and get that territory. And there was, in London, a desire to recoup some of that money. Many people in the British government thought the American colonists had caused the war with France by trying to move into the Ohio Territory, which the French claimed, and by antagonizing the Indians by trying to settle on their land. So Parliament passed some laws. One was the Proclamation Line Law Act, and it said that British colonists in North America couldn't settle in the Ohio Territory. They couldn't go over the Appalachian Mountains and live there. That was being basically set aside for the Indians for at least a while. And a lot of American colonists said, oh no, we fought that war so we could have that land. And they wanted in. They resented the British government telling they couldn't. But also the war had cost the British a lot. And they knew to protect the colonists from the Indians and maybe from the French coming back, they would have to garrison lots of British soldiers in North America. And they thought that the American colonists should pay part of the bill for those British troops and for the war that they had fought to protect them. So they passed the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. These were two revenue measures. You study these in American history, I'll bet. Passed by the British Parliament, taxing the American colonists. But the colonists resented this because you'll remember there were no American colonists in the British Parliament in London. The American colonists were being taxed under a law passed by Englishmen in England, taxing them. And they felt, you remember the famous expression, no taxation without representation. And they rebelled against these laws. Eventually, the British repealed the Stamp Act and so on after lots of American protest, but they kept insisting they had the right to tax Americans if they wanted to, and eventually they would impose a tax in the Tea Act. Imported tea from India, British India, to the Americas was going to be taxed, and the money going back to England. So this all would come back again in the early 1700s. And the Americans would protest. You remember the Boston Tea Party and all that business. Well, the British would send troops to try to enforce the Tea Act. They tried to close Boston Harbor, the Intolerable Acts, as the American colonists called them. And finally, the War for Independence was on. Okay, so that we're not going to get into the military history of the American War for Independence. I love talking about it, but that's American History 1. But you'll remember that the colonies needed a government. When they declared their independence in July of 1776, these 13 colonies declared themselves free and independent states. But they knew they had to hang together to have any hope of winning the war against Great Britain. So they needed to be unified, but they also thought of themselves very much as 13 independent states. So how do you get 13 independent states unified to fight a war? Well, the answer they came up with was the Articles of Confederation. This was our first governing document as the United States of America. Although it took till 1781, it took 5 years to hammer it out and get enough states to ratify it that it went into effect. But the Articles of Confederation that governed the United States of America were a document that was based in the idea of confederation. Confederation, taking 13 powerful, semi-independent states, more or less independent states, and binding them together for particular purposes. And those particular purposes focused primarily on defense, military, because they were fighting the war with Britain. And so they do have a unified command structure for a unified continental army under the Articles of Confederation. The states are levied money to pay for the war. There are a few other things like a desire for a post office that would connect the 13 states. But basically very little was envisioned for the national, quote-unquote, government of the Articles of Confederation to do. The assumption was that most of people's lives wouldn't be governed by the United States, but by their individual state. If you're a Virginian, the government of Virginia runs your life. The United States of America was almost an abstraction of very limited solidity outside of military affairs under the Articles of Confederation. Well, this is how our country was run as a United States, as opposed to 13 independent states, from 1781 until it was replaced in 1789. So for 8 years we had the Articles of Confederation. They did not work. They did not work. Let me explain why not. First off, the government of the United States as a whole was strictly the Congress of the United States. There was no executive branch. There was no national judiciary. All there was Congress. And Congress was designed so that each state had an equal vote. 13 states, 1 vote per state. Now, the states could send as many people to Congress as they wanted. If they wanted 10 people in their delegation, that's great. But they get 1 vote for Virginia, 1 vote for Delaware, 1 vote for Rhode Island. 13 votes. So anything Congress passed was passed by 1 vote per state. All right. Now, the 1 vote per state thing meant that big states were no more powerful in making national decisions than Rhode Island or Delaware was. A big state like Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York had the same power in the government as little states did. And those big states came to resent that they had all these people, all this land, and no more voice than tiny little Rhode Island. So that was one big problem with the Articles of Confederation. The other was Congress had no power to tax. When they tried to get the states to cough up money to run the military or the Navy or to pay for Congress's functions and whatever small things the national government of the Articles of Confederation could do, they couldn't force the states to pay a penny. So that they made recommendations, and some states paid most of what was recommended they pay, and others paid almost nothing. There was no money to run the national government under the Articles. And our military shrank to almost nothing after the War for Independence was over, because states didn't think it was needed anymore. The final massive problem with the Articles of Confederation was about business, commerce. Because each state, now granted the states were fairly large in area, but none of them were massively populous, they knew, the intelligent people knew, if the country was going to thrive, you were going to need to be able to do business between the states. But there was no common money. There were Virginia dollars and New York dollars, and they weren't worth the same amount. There was no United States dollar. It was each state's money. That was a problem. If you're a Virginia, you want to buy from New York, you've got to change your money like you were going to Mexico or something today. That was a problem. An even bigger problem was, what if something goes wrong and it goes to court? There was no national court system. If you were doing business with a New Yorker and you were from, say, South Carolina, you had to sue them in New York court and only New York court if you was going to do any good. A lawsuit in South Carolina wouldn't affect them in the least unless they had property in South Carolina. So this really put a damper on doing business between the states. It meant the economy of the United States was being hobbled because you couldn't really do real business between the states. Different money, different court systems. And of course, if you're a South Carolinian and you sue a New Yorker, he's got home state advantage. The court is almost certainly going to side with him. And there were plenty of people who looked at the Articles of Confederation and said, this is just not working. The military had shrunk to almost nothing. The economy was in a terrible state after the War of Independence ended. There was a massive recession economically. There was a rebellion in western Massachusetts, Shays' Rebellion, and it was eventually put down by local businessmen hiring mercenaries because there was no national military to help put down a violent rebellion. It didn't exist anymore. It had shrunk out of existence for all practical purposes. The National United States Army just basically didn't exist. It was all a shell. There was no money. Well, there were plenty of people who said this cannot last. James Madison was one of the most important ones. He will become known as the father of the Constitution, James Madison. He began, along with friends, to argue the Articles of Confederation must be changed, must be revised. And he began to get other important political figures in the colonies to agree. And they agreed to meet in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, the very building, Independence Hall we call it today, Carpenter's Hall was called back then, where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. In the summer of 1787, representatives from all the colonies except Rhode Island, who didn't want the Articles changed at all because they knew they were going to lose power if they were, to come together in Philadelphia. And eventually Madison convinced the most important man of all, George Washington, the man who was most a symbol of the nation of the United States of America, the man who'd led us to victory in the war. He agreed to take part in the convention modifying the Articles of Confederation. But James Madison already secretly knew he wanted to scrap the Articles entirely. He thought they were so bad they could not be fixed. He didn't tell a lot of people this before they got to Philadelphia. Technically, they came to revise the Articles together. But when they got there, within a few days, he's already talking about, let's drop them entirely and come up with something new. The something new they will hammer out in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia would be the United States Constitution we have today. This gathering will be known as the Constitutional Convention. July 1787, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a convention presided over by George Washington as president, at which James Madison had a leading voice that will make him the father of the Constitution. In the next lecture, I'll explain more about that. But you've got a little worksheet. I want you to jot down some words, phrases, thoughts about the Articles of Confederation, what they were like, and why they didn't work and needed to be revised. Thank you.